In the spring of 2009, a woman named Vera Doss knelt down in a field outside Laramie County, Wyoming, pressed her bare palm flat against cracked, pale earth, and held it there while the county extension agent standing behind her said, in a voice that carried not a trace of cruelty, that she was looking at biological desert. He meant it as a kindness. He wanted her to understand what everyone else in the county had already concluded. The field was approximately 340 acres of former cropland, chemically exhausted by decades of intensive farming, droughted into alkaline hardpan, and officially abandoned by its previous owner in 1997. The Laramie County Agricultural Assessment had classified it as non-viable for agricultural use. The State University's Land Reclamation Office had declined to study it for restoration because, in their estimation, there was nothing left to restore. Vera Doss had just spent her savings purchasing it. 12 years later, in the fall of 2021, a senior program officer from the National Biological Infrastructure Initiative arrived in Laramie County to present Vera with a research and conservation grant of $340,000, awarded for what the panel's citation described as the most significant documented recovery of native High Plains forb diversity on former agricultural land in the modern record. The extension agent, who had once stood behind her in that pale field, was invited to the ceremony. He came, and he stayed 3 hours afterward in the barn, asking questions, taking notes in a small spiral pad he had brought himself. That is the distance between 2009 and 2021. This is what happened in between. Let me tell you about Vera Doss first, because the field does not make sense without her. She was 38 years old when she bought that land. She held a doctorate in plant ecology from the University of Colorado and had spent 11 years doing contract botanical survey work for federal agencies across the Intermountain West, cataloging what grew where and why. She was known for two things among the people who hired her: an absolute unwillingness to summarize data she had not personally collected, and a habit of walking land on her hands and knees, a method she had picked up from her grandmother, a woman named Loretta who had kept a dry land garden in Natrona County for 40 years, and who claimed you could not understand a piece of ground unless you got low enough to smell it. Vera did not have a ranching background. She was not a farmer in any formal sense. She had a used truck, a rented house on the edge of Cheyenne, and as of March 2009, a piece of land everyone in Laramie County had written off as a cautionary tale about what intensive farming did to ground that had no thickness to give. She had found the property through a state surplus listing and had recognized the parcel number from a soil survey she had conducted 6 years earlier for a federal grazing inventory. She remembered walking its edge in 2003 and noticing, at the drainage in the northwest corner, a thin film of biological soil crust still clinging to the surface between two stones. The cryptogamic mat of cyanobacteria and fungal filaments that forms only where ground has not been heavily disturbed for many years. It was barely there. A person not looking for it would have stepped over it. She had photographed it and filed the photo and forgotten it until she saw the parcel come up for sale. She drove out, parked, walked to the drainage, and knelt. The crust was still there, cracked by 12 more years of foot traffic from deer and antelope, thinner than she remembered. She pressed her palm against the ground beside it and held it there. And in the thin, pale crust, she saw something else, a white thread of mycelium running under the surface crack, barely visible. She did not say it aloud. She was not yet certain enough. She drove back to Cheyenne, called her bank, and made an offer on the land. The extension agent's name was Dale Moss. He was 54 at the time, with a master's degree in agricultural science from the University of Wyoming and 22 years of field experience covering the eastern Wyoming counties. He was not dismissive of Vera personally. He had read 2 of her survey papers and respected the rigor of her methodology. He simply believed that the land she had purchased was, in the only language the agricultural system had for it, dead. He had the assessment numbers. He had the soil chemistry reports from the university's Extension Soil Laboratory, showing sodium accumulation in the surface horizon, near zero organic matter, a pH of 9.1 in the most degraded sections. He had the satellite vegetation index maps, which showed the field as a uniform pale beige in every growing season from 1998 onward, the color code assigned to biological 0. When he drove out that spring morning at Vera's invitation and stood at the field's edge, he told her she was throwing good money after a classification problem. The land had been classified correctly. No amount of enthusiasm, he said carefully, would reclassify it. He said this without scorn. He said it the way an experienced man says something he genuinely believes the listener needs to hear before committing further resources. He was a decent person, doing what the system he worked inside asked him to do, which was apply the best available instruments to the best available data and produce a recommendation. The instrument said biological 0. He said biological desert. It's what the data says, he told her, standing at the field's edge in a university-branded fleece. Vera looked out at the field for a moment before she answered. Data is what you were able to measure, she said. Dale nodded patiently. He had heard this argument before, usually from people who wanted to grow something impractical and needed a reason not to accept the numbers. He did not think Vera was wrong in principle. He simply thought that what his instruments had been unable to measure in that field was nothing, because there was nothing there to measure. She did not correct him that morning. She had not earned the standing to do so yet. She thanked him for coming and watched his truck drive back out on the county road and turned to face 340 acres of pale, cracked ground that belonged to her. What she did in the field that first year was not dramatic to look at, and this matters, because the entire story turns on the difference between what the casual observer saw and what was actually happening. She put up a 3-wire fence around the entire 340 acres and posted it against vehicle traffic. She installed a series of shallow swales, small hand-dug trenches, running along the field's contour at 30-foot intervals, designed to slow water movement across the surface and allow precipitation to infiltrate rather than sheet off the hardpan. She made one targeted application of calcium sulfate, gypsum dissolved in water, to the most severely alkaline surface patches, a standard soil reclamation practice. But she did it by hand with a backpack sprayer rather than with contracted spray equipment, and she applied it only where the pH reading exceeded 9.0. She did not introduce any seed. She did not apply any fertilizer. She did not do anything the county agricultural extension program had a category for, because what she was attempting did not appear in any county agricultural extension program. She was not trying to grow a crop. She was trying to remove disturbance long enough to find out whether anything was still alive underground. If you want to understand what Vera believed was happening in that field, you have to understand what she knew about the soil seed bank, because that knowledge is the whole foundation. Let me explain what a soil seed bank is, because the grant and the vindication and the $340,000 check are arithmetic built on a mechanism most people never get to see. The soil seed bank is the reservoir of dormant seeds, root fragments, and spores that native plant communities have stored underground, sometimes for decades, sometimes for a century or more. Seeds of native forbs, the flowering broadleaf plants of the high plains, can remain viable in the seed bank for 20, 30, or 60 years, depending on the species, sealed in the soil at the depth where they landed or were buried by soil movement, held in a state between living and germinating, waiting for conditions that signal the right time to emerge. Some species form seed banks that persist for far longer than 60 years. The mechanisms that trigger germination are specific, and they are exacting. Some species require a period of cold stratification, a freeze-thaw cycle, before the seed coat softens. Some require a specific soil-fungal community to be present before the seedling can establish. Some require a physical disturbance to bring the seed to the surface, but the disturbance must be shallow, not the kind that buries the seed bank deeper or exposes it to conditions that kill it. What 40 years of heavy conventional farming does to a seed bank is not simply remove plants. The tillage disrupts the physical stratification, burying seeds that need to be near the surface and exposing seeds that need darkness and moisture. The herbicide programs kill not only the target weeds, but the native forbs that might otherwise compete with them. The ammonium nitrate fertilizer changes the soil chemistry in ways that suppress the mycorrhizal fungal networks that native plants depend on for establishment. The compaction from heavy equipment breaks down the soil pore structure that allows water infiltration and root penetration. Each of these pressures compounds the others. Taken together, they suppress germination so completely that the satellite instruments see nothing, the county assessment sees nothing, and a trained agronomist with 22 years of experience drives out and says, "Biological dessert," and is telling the truth as his instruments reveal it. What his instruments are not calibrated to see is what is still underground, waiting. Vera had spent 11 years walking the Intermountain West and had seen this process run in both directions. She had documented native plant recovery on disturbed roadsides, on abandoned irrigation ditches, on ground that had been scraped and let alone and then produced species that had not been recorded in the county for a generation. She had talked, in calls that ran past midnight, to a retired plant ecologist at the University of New Mexico named Dr. Hector Reyes, who had spent 40 years studying native forb persistence in disturbed soils across the southern Rockies and had documented seed bank viability in fields abandoned from agriculture for periods of up to 80 years. He had told her, in one of those late-night conversations, that the critical variable was not how long the seed bank had been suppressed. It was whether the suppression had been physically catastrophic, whether tillage had gone deep enough and hard enough often enough to destroy the seed itself. Ammonium nitrate did not destroy seeds. Herbicides killed plants, not buried seeds. The tillage was the variable, and the field Vera had bought had been tilled with a disc harrow to a depth of 8 inches, which was deep for the crop, but not deep enough, in most seasons, to disturb the seed bank horizon at 12 to 16 inches, where many native forb seeds rested. She had also read her grandmother's journal. Loretta had kept it for 4 decades, filling its pages with pressed specimens and handwritten notes in cramped, precise script, the script of a woman who loved plants without ever having a reason to publish what she knew. Among those pages was a single observation Loretta had made in 1974, after a county road crew scraped a bar ditch near her property to improve drainage. Within 2 growing seasons, Loretta had written, "The scraped strip produced 17 species of native plants that had not been visible in the surrounding grazed pasture for as long as anyone she knew could remember." She had pressed 6 of those specimens into the journal beside the entry. She had written next to them in pencil 2 words: waiting, just waiting. Vera had pinned that page to the wall above her work table the week she bought the field. She read it every morning that first year. In the spring of 2010, in the second growing season after she fenced the field, Vera found the first evidence that she was right. She was walking the northwest drainage on her hands and knees, moving slowly, running her eyes at ground level across the pale surface, when she saw them. 8 seedlings of plains, penstemon, a native wildflower with a narrow tubular flower, pushing through the soil crust in a patch no larger than a kitchen table. She lay flat on her stomach and looked at them for a long time before she got out her notebook. She photographed them with her camera, recorded the GPS coordinates, measured the patch dimensions. She did not tell anyone. She came back 3 days later and found, in a separate location near one of the contour swales, 11 seedlings of buffalo burr clover, a nitrogen-fixing forb that historically covered large portions of the high plains before the plow arrived. The week after that, in the eastern section of the field, she found 4 plants she identified as prairie evening primrose, a species that had not appeared in any Laramie County botanical survey since 1983, 27 years of absence from the record. She sat in the field with those 4 plants for a long time. The field was pale and still around her, the wind coming across from the east. Rudd, her border collie, lying at a distance watching her, the way dogs watch when they are not sure what their person is doing. She did not celebrate. She went home and entered the data in her spreadsheet and called Dr. Reyes in New Mexico and read him the list. He was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, "How many acres of undisturbed establishment zone do you have?" "All of it," she said. He said, "Don't touch anything." She wasn't planning to. By the end of the 2010 growing season, Vera had recorded 34 native forb species on ground that the county's assessment had classified as non-viable. 34 species. The number was invisible from every road. It did not show up on any satellite image in any category Dale Moss or the university's remote sensing lab had access to. Gary Lund, who farmed the 680 acres of winter wheat in the adjacent township, drove past the field on his way to the elevator twice a week and saw no change. Vera entered her data in columns and came back the following spring. Gary Lund. Let me tell you about Gary, because his story is not separate from Vera's. He farmed his 680 acres on a plan built with Dale's direct assistance in 2007, one of the most ambitious operations in the township. A modern semi-dwarf winter wheat variety with a certified seed purity guarantee, precision nitrogen application timed to growing degree days using a proprietary sensor system, a full fungicide program, and a line of machinery that carried monthly payments totaling $4,200. Gary was not reckless. He was not careless. He had followed every recommendation the extension system offered and had adopted every efficiency the system endorsed, and his yields in 2009 reflected it. 42 bushels per acre, 4 above the county average, producing a gross that looked fine on paper, though the paper also showed the equipment line and the input costs and the variable rate operating loan, and the margin between those numbers was, at 42 bushels, thin. Gary worked the ground hard and kept it clean, the way his father had farmed before him, though his father had used older equipment and more elbow grease and fewer inputs, and carried no equipment debt to speak of. Gary had been told, and had believed, that efficiency was the direction the system rewarded, and the first few years had confirmed it. His fields were uniform and green in a good growing year, and they were productive on paper, and they were, by every metric the county extension office tracked, a success He drove past Vera's pale-fenced acres twice a week and did not think much about them. He had bigger margins to worry about. He had inputs to time and moisture to watch, and a combine that needed a belt replaced before harvest. Gary thought Vera's project was, as he told Dale at the co-op one evening in 2010, a science experiment that would eventually end and let somebody buy the land and do something useful with it. He said this without malice. He had seen a lot of restoration projects on difficult land. He had never seen one that paid for itself. He was, in every way, the system he worked inside could measure, the more credible operator. At the township's spring extension meeting in 2011, Gary sat in the back row while Dale gave a presentation on input optimization for the coming season, and then at the end mentioned in passing that a land restoration project in the county had been generating some unusual botanical observations. He did not name Vera. He did not dwell on it. Gary leaned over to the man beside him and said he hoped whoever was running that project had a second income, because the ground around Laramie County did not restore itself for free. The room had laughed, lightly, the laugh of people who know the economics and find sentiment recognizable. It was not a cruel laugh. Gary was not a cruel man. He was a man who understood land the way the system he inhabited had taught him to understand it, which was as a platform for production, measurable by yield, valuable by the bushel. Dale Moss continued to monitor. In the spring of 2011, he drove out unannounced after someone at the county conservation office mentioned that Vera had been submitting species occurrence records to the state botanical database, and that some of the submissions had been flagged by the database's review system because the species names were unusual for a site carrying a non-viable classification. Dale walked the field with Vera for most of a morning, which meant he walked it on his feet while she walked it on her knees, and he was quiet and careful and thorough. He crouched at the prairie evening primrose patch in the eastern section and looked at the plants for a long time. He stood up and said, carefully, that he was not sure what she had done to stimulate that establishment. "I didn't stimulate it," she said. "I got out of the way." He wrote something in his notepad. He did not argue. He said he would need to see the full data set before he could say anything official. He drove away, and Vera sat down where she was and ate the lunch she had packed and watched a red-tailed hawk work the fence line, and Rudd lay beside her and put his chin on her knee. Then came July of 2012. The summer drought that year was the worst in Wyoming in recorded history, or close enough to it that the difference was immaterial to the people who lived through it. The Palmer Drought Severity Index for Laramie County in June and July of 2012 reached levels not seen since the 1930s, which was the last time the High Plains had been asked to survive this kind of sustained heat and dryness. The winter wheat crop across the county averaged 11 bushels per acre against an expected 44. Gary Lunn lost 58% of his planted acres to drought stress. The surviving crop did not cover his input costs for the year, and it did not come near his equipment payments. He carried $312,000 in outstanding equipment and operating debt at variable rates that had moved upward twice since he had signed the financing in 2007. He told Dale in August that he was not certain he could hold the operation through a second consecutive bad year. Dale told him to file for emergency drought assistance and talk to his lender about refinancing options. He said it with genuine concern for a man he had worked with for years. It was the only advice the system inside which he worked had to offer. Vera's 340 acres in the drought, summer of 2012, looked from the road like every other piece of dry ground in the county. Pale, dusty, The soil surface cracked in the bare patches. It did not look like a victory. It did not look like anything a casual observer would notice. But the swales had held the thin winter snowmelt, and the sparse spring rains and infiltrated them slowly into the subsoil, and the native plants that had been emerging for 2 growing seasons had root systems that reached, depending on species, between 2 and 7 feet into that subsoil. They were not drawing from the top 6 inches of soil, the way a planted annual crop does. They were drawing from the deep moisture reserve that the swales had built. Some of the most stress-sensitive plants went summer dormant in July, which looked like death from a distance and was not. The biodiversity of the plant community was itself a buffer against a single, catastrophic event. Because 51 species cannot be eliminated simultaneously by one season of drought, because each species carries a different drought threshold, a different root depth, a different timing strategy. Some of them had survived much worse than 2012 over the course of their evolutionary history. The ones that went dormant would come back in September. The ones that held green held it because of where their roots were. The field that had looked weakest in every growing season from 2009 to 2011. The field that had carried the county's official classification of non-viable, while Gary Lunn's field carried 42 bushels to the elevator, looked in the drought of 2012 like the most alive piece of ground in the immediate county. Dale Moss drove out in September of that year and stood at the fence line for a long time before he called Vera. She drove out and found him standing very still, looking across the field, where the penstemon had gone to seed, and the burr clover had held its leaves, and the dry mosaic of 51 species in the northwest corner showed the kind of diversity that a uniform planted field, however well managed, could never approximate. "It didn't crash," he said. "No," she said. He was quiet. Then he said that he had a question about her monitoring protocol, whether she would be willing to walk him through the full data set from 2009 forward. He said this in the careful register of a man who has been shown that a question he had considered settled is, in fact, still open. He was not conceding anything yet. He was a scientist at heart, which meant he needed more data before he would concede anything. She understood that, and she respected it. She said she would walk him through all of it. That November, Gary Lunn sold 180 of his 680 acres. He did it because his lender required it as a condition of the refinancing, and he did it with the quiet grief of a farmer reducing his operation, which is a particular kind of grief that people outside the work rarely understand. He was not broken by it. He adjusted. He planted 500 acres the following season and worked harder inside a smaller footprint and waited to see what the next year's moisture would bring. In the meantime, Vera's species count climbed. 58 native forb species by the end of the 2013 growing season. 64 by 2015. She had added a second monitoring transect in the southwestern section of the field in 2013 and had found, in the subsoil of that section, evidence of what Dr. Reyes described in their ongoing collaboration as a mycorrhizal network in partial recovery, meaning the fungal infrastructure that native plants use to share water and nutrients through their root systems had not been entirely destroyed by the years of tillage and herbicide application and was rebuilding itself, species by species, as the above-ground plant diversity increased and gave it more hosts to connect. This was not something Vera had introduced. She had not inoculated the soil with any fungal culture. The network was rebuilding from the fragments that had survived in the undisturbed deep horizon, the same tier where the seed bank had waited. She wrote up these findings in a paper with Dr. Reyes, which was published in a peer-reviewed ecology journal in 2016. The paper's reviewers were, as Dale Moss noted when he read it, rigorous. The methodology was thorough. The data was exactly what Vera would have produced. Precise, qualified, conservative in its claims, difficult to argue with on any technical ground. That paper reached Dale's desk through the county extension office's journal alert system, which flagged articles mentioning Laramie County land. He read it on a Thursday afternoon in late winter, once straight through and then again from the beginning, stopping at the tables showing the species count curve from 2010 to 2015 and the pH decline curve from 2009 to 2015. He set the paper down and sat with it for a few minutes before picking it up and reading the discussion section a third time. The paper's discussion noted, carefully and with appropriate qualification, that the recovery rate observed on the study site exceeded the published models for passive restoration on former agricultural land by a factor of approximately 2, and that the most plausible explanation for the discrepancy was a seed bank that had not been as severely degraded by the tillage regime as the standard models predicted for that soil type and depth. It was the kind of finding that, if the data held, required revising the model. Dale folded the journal and put it in his desk drawer and left it there for 2 weeks before he took it out again and reread the methodology section. Dale read the paper twice. He drove out to the field in March of 2017 and walked with Vera for the third time. The field looked different now than it had in 2011, different enough that even someone without a trained eye could see it. The northwest quarter had a visible green flush in the early spring, the burr clover and the early forbs coming up ahead of the surrounding pasture. The drainage carried a shallow, persistent trickle from the swales even in dry March, and along its banks 5 species of native sedge and grass had established, the first grass establishment Vera had recorded on the site. Dale crouched at the sedge patch and turned a handful of soil between his fingers. He held it to his nose and then looked up. "That's mycorrhizal activity," he said. "Yes," she said. He set the soil down. He said he was going to write a note to the regional ecologist at the state's Natural Heritage Program, recommending a formal site assessment. He said it the way he said most things, carefully and without fanfare. He drove away, and Vera put her hand on Rudd's back, and they walked the full 340 acres together as the March wind came across from the north. In 2018, a senior program officer from the National Biological Infrastructure Initiative named Carla Voth flew into Cheyenne from Washington, D.C., and drove a rental car out to Laramie County on a Tuesday morning in late June. She had read Vera's 2 published papers. She had the site dossier the Natural Heritage Program had compiled, which ran to 40 pages of monitoring data, species occurrence maps, and soil chemistry change curves, tracking the pH decline from 9.1 in 2009 to 7.4 in the most improved sections by 2017. She had questions she had written down on her legal pad during the plane ride, specific technical questions about the gypsum application rate calculations and the Forbes species identification methodology for the more morphologically challenging genera, and the long-term viability modeling for the mycorrhizal network recovery rate. She was not easy to impress. Carla had spent 19 years evaluating conservation projects across the northern Rockies, and she had learned that the difference between a project that was genuinely doing something and a project that was doing paperwork was almost always audible in the way the person running it answered questions. She had learned to listen for the pause before the answer, the pause that meant the person was deciding what to say rather than reporting what they knew. Vera did not pause. She answered every question with the number or the method or the date. And when Carla asked a question Vera could not answer with precision, she said so and told her what the uncertainty was and how she was working to resolve it. They walked the field together for 4 hours, moving from the northwest drainage to the southwestern monitoring transect to the eastern section where the prairie evening primrose patch had expanded to cover nearly a quarter acre. Carla crouched at the drainage and looked at the sedge community along its bank for a long time. She turned over a handful of soil and looked at the white mycelium threading through it. She set the soil down carefully. "How many native forb species are you currently carrying?" she said. Vera said, 73. Carla was quiet. She wrote on her legal pad. She did not say anything else for a moment. 73. On 340 acres of ground the county had classified as non-viable for agricultural use. 73 native forb species on ground that the Satellite Vegetation Index had mapped as biological 0 in every growing season from 1998 through 2009. The State Botanical Survey's established benchmark for a high-quality native remnant prairie in Laramie County was 40 species. A site carrying 40 native forb species was considered exceptional, the kind of rare remnant worth protecting. Vera's former dead field had exceeded that benchmark by 33 species without being seeded, without being chemically treated beyond the single gypsum application, without any intervention beyond a fence, some hand-dug swales, and 11 years of being left alone. 73 landed the way a large number lands when everyone in the room has been thinking about the smaller number for a long time. Carla did not change her expression. She was a professional, and her face did not work that way in the field. She wrote something on her legal pad and asked 2 more technical questions about the species identification protocols, and then thanked Vera for her time and drove back toward Cheyenne. She did not negotiate on the grant amount. The award was announced in October of 2021, $340,000 from the National Biological Infrastructure Initiative's Conservation Biology Track, the largest single award that program had issued in 6 years. The panel citation ran to 4 paragraphs and used language that was unusual for a government grant document. It noted the species count. It noted the methodology. It noted the seed bank literature Vera had built the restoration approach on. And in a closing paragraph, it noted what the panel called the role of observational inheritance in the design of the recovery protocol, specifically the contribution of informal ecological knowledge transmitted through family connection, including a handwritten field note made by a Natrona County dryland gardener named Loretta in 1974. Vera read that paragraph 3 times. Then she called Dr. Reyes in New Mexico and read it to him over the phone, and he was quiet on the line for a moment before he said that Loretta would have found it fitting that the grant was the same dollar amount as the acreage. Vera said she had noticed that too. The ceremony was held in the barn on the property in November, after the season's monitoring was complete. Dale Moss arrived before it started and took a seat in the second row. He shook hands with Carla Voth and introduced himself and said he was the extension agent who had told Vera the field was biological desert in 2009. Carla looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "And what do you think it is now?" He said he thought it was the most significant ecological recovery he had personally observed in 23 years of fieldwork in Laramie County, and that he wished he had had the instruments to see it sooner. 3 graduate students sat in the front row. They had spent the summer on the site, running monitoring transects and soil sampling and updating the species occurrence database Vera had started in 2010. They were writing their own papers on pieces of the dataset now. Two of them had asked Vera whether they could continue their field seasons here for the duration of their dissertations. She had said yes. Two of the neighboring landowners sat in folding chairs near the back of the barn, Gary Lund among them, his hat on his knee, listening to the grant citation being read aloud. When the citation reached the species count, he leaned slightly forward in his chair. He had 29 species on his 60-acre parcel now. The citation said 73. He did the math quietly in his head and did not say anything. After the ceremony, after the other guests had left, Dale stayed at the barn table with a cup of coffee and Vera's grandmother's journal open in front of him. He turned the pages slowly and stopped at the bar ditch entry with the 6 pressed specimens. He read it twice. He asked Vera, sitting across from him, to walk him through what she had understood in March of 2009, standing in the field for the first time, that his soil chemistry report had not been able to capture. She told him about the biological soil crust at the drainage. She told him about the mycelium thread she had glimpsed in the surface crack, and had been too uncertain to name aloud that morning when he drove out. "You should have told me," he said. "You wouldn't have had a category for it," she said. He thought about that for a moment and looked at the pressed specimens in the journal. "No," he said. "I wouldn't have?" He turned the page carefully. "What happens to the field now?" She told him about the grant's monitoring program, which would run for at least 10 years, with 4 graduate students each summer continuing the seed bank recovery research. She told him about the conservation easement in negotiation with the Natural Heritage Program, which would protect the site's species diversity in perpetuity regardless of who owned it. She told him about the establishment guide she had written, a plain document describing the full recovery protocol, which she had given to anyone who asked. Gary Lund had asked. In the winter of 2019, standing at her door with his hat in his hands, he had a 60-acre parcel that had been underperforming for years and that he did not know what else to do with. She had driven out with him and walked it in the cold. She had knelt in the soil at the edge of a low drainage and pressed her palm flat. She had felt the crust. She had told him what to do, which was mostly what not to do. "Fence it," she said. "Get out of the way." He followed the protocol. By 2023, the 60 acres had produced 29 native forb species and was being grazed carefully. On a rotational schedule, the plant community could sustain, producing forage that cost Gary almost nothing to grow because it cost him almost nothing to manage. He came back to Vera in the spring of 2023 and said he was thinking about converting another 80 acres on the north end of his operation. She said she would walk it with him. 2 other neighbors had made similar requests. 3 operations in Laramie County were running partial conversions. None of them were spectacular. None of them had made anyone wealthy in the short run. All of them were producing something that the county's assessment tools still had difficulty measuring, which was resilience on a per-acre basis. The capacity of a piece of ground to hold its function and its plant diversity through a bad year without collapsing into the pale uniform beige that the satellite maps assign to biological zero. Loretta's journal sat on Vera's work table in the evenings, the ribbon still marking the bar ditch page. Rudd slept beside the table most nights, gray around his muzzle now, occasionally lifting his head when the wind shifted, then settling again with a long exhale. The work table carried the graduate students' monitoring reports and the draft of a third paper with Dr. Reyes. This one on the rate of mycorrhizal network recovery as a function of surface diversity, and a stack of establishment guide copies she had printed to hand out at a range management workshop the following February. The field was 3 miles away. It was carrying, at last count, 73 native forb species and 12 native grass species on ground that an official government assessment had classified as non-viable for agricultural use 14 years ago. And those species had been there the whole time, underground, intact, waiting for the disturbance to stop. There is a kind of knowledge that travels in systems. Instruments, models, satellite indices, soil chemistry reports, yield assessments, classification matrices. That knowledge is genuinely valuable. It measures what it was calibrated to measure, and it gets better every decade as the instruments improve. Dale Moss was not wrong to use it. He was applying the best available reading of what the system could see, and what the system could see in that field was accurately described. The instruments were not broken. They were simply not pointed at the right thing. There is another kind that travels in people, usually slowly, rarely through formal channels, almost always through the kind of attention that requires getting low enough to the ground to smell it. It lives in 11 years of walking land on your hands and knees. It lives in a marbled composition notebook in a grandmother's handwriting, pressed specimens and 2 words in pencil beside the bar ditch plants. It lives in the understanding that a classification system tells you what it was designed to see, which is not always everything that is there. The field Vera Doss bought in 2009 was classified as dead because every instrument pointed at it was calibrated to read life as something that could be harvested and sold on a commodity market. The seed bank did not appear in any of those readings. It was not visible from any satellite. It was not documented in any county assessment. It existed in the 12-inch horizon, where the tillage had not quite reached, in the spores and fragments that had outlasted every year of suppression, in the exact form of persistence that no spreadsheet has yet been built to measure. The land does not always announce what it is holding. It waits for someone patient enough and close enough to the ground to ask. What is rigid breaks. What keeps its roots down holds.